So today we're talking about odd divisions on triangle grids. I've got a couple different setups of triangle grids here to demonstrate with. And we're going to start with the easiest triangle grid, the triangle grid on a hexagon. So this is following up from last week's live stream on odd divisions on square grids. Now we're going to use the same exact methods to get our triangle grid into odd divisions. So let's say I've got this triangle grid and I'm going to just emphasize my lines here with the pen. And I'm going to choose to just emphasize the lines on one side of the paper because that's all we really need. And now we have these three triangles, very visible. And what we want to do for this one is divide it in 3 even pieces. So I'm going to say, okay, well, this is convenient. I have 1 and 2 already set up for me. And 1 plus 2 is 3, so if I have the diagonals crossing, then the intersection of those diagonals will be 2 from the top and 1 from the bottom. And when we do that, when we fold these diagonals, and again, for demonstration purposes this time, I'm going to fold them all the way through, but I would not fold all the way through if I was doing a grid that I wanted to keep nice. So getting that line through in one direction, I notice that what I've done in folding that diagonal is bring one corner of a triangle to another corner of a triangle, and this makes a line halfway through the triangle as a whole. And I'm actually going to do the exact same thing in the other half of my big trapezoid. I'm going to be folding this same triangle in half in the other direction. And I should mention, by the way, that this division of a triangle grid on a hexagon in thirds is exactly what my students in Basic Twist Bootcamp need to know for the 10th lesson. And so now I've got my intersection, and unlike what we did with the square grids last time, I have my wider count on top and my skinnier count on the bottom. So I've got 1 spacing to the bottom and 2 spacings to the top. So what did we learn right here? We learned that by dividing a triangle in half in 2 directions, finding the center of the triangle is 1/3 from the side and 2/3 from the point. So we can use that even if we're not even if we don't have this full trapezoid. So we've got a special case for thirds on triangle grid on whatever shape. And so to continue this, I'm going to go to the side that has 2, and I'm going to rotate it so I'm folding away from me, and bring this point of the triangle up to the point of my target intersection. And I want to be careful here that I'm bringing it to this intersection and not these intersections with the edge of the triangle. That's another reason why I only fold a pinch very close to the intersection when I'm doing this on my own grids. So bringing my point up, and I'll make this more clear so everyone can see where that point is. Bringing that up to meet the intersection of diagonals, I fold all the way across. Use my bone folder to make it a nice hard fold. And then I have a choice. I can choose to propagate those thirds while I have my paper in this orientation, and that's what I generally do choose. I bring my bottom edge up to that third that I just put in and fold across, and then come down 2 spacings, just like I was propagating on the fifths on the square grid in the last video, and get my thirds on this side before rotating my paper back to fold my bottom edge up to get my thirds here. And this fold will go exactly through my target intersection. So this example is a really strong case that we can see that this intersection of diagonals is going to work for all 3 directions of grid. And how could it not? It's in the exact center of this starting triangle. So it's like the diagonal, the full diagonal through a square. It's going to work in all directions. So rotating my paper so that this target intersection is above my halfway line, I'm going to bring my bottom edge up, and this time I have the corner of my paper coming to that intersection point, and I'm also matching several of my grid lines on top with lines below. Got 2 instances of that here, and my edge is also lining up with a grid line, so I have multiple references here. Folding all the way across, I then open and finish the thirds in this half of the paper before rotating around. And typically I would have reversed the creases for the thirds in the first direction before doing the second direction, but here we are. And so we've got 3 and 1/3 above makes 4, so I can bring this flap, this bottom flap, all the way up to that 4 line, 1 above the center, and fold all the way through, opening up, coming to the line that I just made, which, remember, 4 divided by 2 is 2, and so 2 is even and can be divided in half. Then we need a third direction, and no matter whether your target intersection is good for all 3 directions or not, you will always be able to get the third direction without putting in additional references, because if you notice here, we already have all the grid intersections. So I've got intersections all the way across. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 points that I can bring my bottom edge to. So that's effectively line to line, because anytime you have at least 2 points to bring something to, that is a line. 2 points to find a line. And so we have 4 that are collinear. That's more than enough to get our references for the third direction. So once I get one side, I'll rotate around and do the same thing, bringing up 1 spacing past the center line, or I should say bringing my bottom edge up 1 spacing past the center line, folding all the way through, and then opening, bringing that bottom edge to the fold that I just made, and done. And as I mentioned before, I would be reversing each of these new folds after I finish the direction with the 4 new folds. So that's thirds on a hexagon. Let's take a look at another shape. Let's take a look at fifths on this triangle grid on a square. So let me emphasize these grid lines for you. And if you're curious about how to fold triangle grids on a square, I'll make sure to put a link in the video description once I'm done about how to fold triangle grids on either direction of rectangle, which can be generalized to a square as well. So I've got my starting lines and I'm targeting 5 divisions. Well, there is no way that I can get 5 divisions on here right now because I don't have any 2 numbers that add to 5. I don't even have a full 2 spacings on here. So I'm missing the corner over here and over here. If I wanted to, I could still divide in 3 because I know that trick with the center of the triangle. So I could bring this corner to this corner and then to this corner, pinching in the middle each time and get that intersection for thirds. But with fifths, I'm going to need some more lines. So I'm going to go ahead and divide this grid in half in each direction. So I'm choosing to do the diagonal direction first, and this time I am reversing my grid lines. And as I get set up for this, think about what other division you would like to see me do. So I did thirds, we're doing fifths now. Comment in the chat what division you'd like to see me do on the next grid, on a rotated grid. And it can be one of these that we've done already, or it can be something new, like sevenths or 11ths or 13ths or something. And one of the questions that came up last week was, well, what if you want 3 and then 5 to get 15? How would you do that? And my answer is still the same. You're going to want to do the thirds first, and once you do the thirds, you will have as many divisions as you need to get the references for the fifths. So the other question that comes up with this kind of grid, triangle grid on a square, is how do you count? I see a lot of diagonal lines that start on one side with a grid intersection, but end on the other not on a grid intersection. Therefore, how do you count this grid? And my answer is I count the spacings that are parallel to the edges. So I have 1, 2, and soon to be 3 and 4 spacings on this grid. So for today's purposes, I'm going to draw just this one more line in here and reverse those last 2. And then we're going to start looking at where we can get fifths. So with 5, one of the things that we were talking about with the square grid is you want to start with an unmarked square and do the fifths right away. So you would want to do a power of 2 and the remainder. So that would lead you to do 4 and 1. But with the triangles, what you really want to do here is to have your trapezoid be all on grid lines. That's going to make it easiest for getting your new divisions for 2 reasons. The first reason is because if your trapezoid is all on grid lines, so 2 and 3 here, then your intersection of diagonals will be exactly on a grid intersection, and it will work for multiple directions. And also, your grid intersection will line up with a point on the line that is going to be folded up to it. So then you're not folding line to point, which has an infinite number of possible folds. You're folding point to point. And that makes it a lot easier to get good parallel grid lines. So, using my trapezoid of 3 and 2, I need to find where the intersection of diagonals in the center of this trapezoid is. So I'm going to locate 2 corners, 2 opposite corners, and make a fold that goes from one corner to the other. And I was paying attention and saw that wherever the center of this is, it needs to be in the central triangle of the trapezoid. So when I'm doing this, I'm saying, okay, my edge of 3 is these 3, and so this is my central triangle. I'm going to make the pinch inside of that triangle right there. And I did it about here to here. And I'll mark that for you, because I know the intersection is going to be right under this point because my trapezoid is centered. This is the center of the trapezoid. The intersection has to be on the center line. Then I'll do the same thing in the other direction, being very careful about getting corner to corner. And then here it's easier to see where my pinch already is, and I can pinch right over that mark to get the intersection of my diagonals. And now I have 2 spaces above this mark, 3 spaces below, because I had 2 above and 3 below in the trapezoid. But folding this point into here, that's the even of the 2 and the 3, is a really small space, and I don't think that would actually be that accurate. So instead, I'm going to look down below, and I've got another point that can fold into here. So we've got the 5 total divisions plus 3 is 8. And so with 8, that gives me a very strong number, because I know with 8 I can keep dividing it in half and half and half until I'm done. So I divide in half, I get 4. Divide in half again, and I get 2. Divide in half again, and I get 1. And so that gets me most of the way there. I've got this 3 that's missing. And how can I get 3? Well, 5 minus 1 is 4, and exactly between 5 and 1 is 3. So I'm going to rotate my paper around, fold my 5 to my 1, to get my 3. And again, using my bone folder to make sure everything is smooth and the folds are crisp. Okay, so now I've got fifths in this upper division, and I need to propagate them down. The first thing I'm going to do is bring up my second big division line. And I know that if I were to bring this all the way to the edge, I would make a fold at the first division line. To make a fold 1 division below, I need to come 2 down from the edge. So coming 2 down from the edge, and this is generalizable to whatever division you're doing. And by the way, we could have said this with the thirds as well. It just becomes much more useful when you're doing more than thirds. And then to get the next division down, I come down 2 more. And you might have guessed it, to get the next division down, I'm going to come down 2 more again. And by the way, keep thinking about the number that you want me to divide the next grid in, and go ahead and write that in the chat if you've got one. And come down 2 more. Again, you'll notice the last line went straight through my target intersection. And now we're bringing those 2 divisions between the target intersection and the edge of the trapezoid with 2 together. And that is much more accurate now that I have a line to fold to instead of point to point. And we're going to repeat that process for the rest of the paper, except now instead of thinking relative to the edge, I'm thinking relative to the next big grid line. So 2 down, and 2 down, which is also known as 1 above the neighboring grid line. Two down again, which is 1 below the neighboring grid line, aka dividing 4 spaces in half. Two down, which is coming to the fold I just made, dividing 2 spaces in half. And then we run out of paper to do 2 down. We jump down to the next big grid line and we come up. This is 8 spaces in half because the whole 2 big grid lines would be 10 because we're doing each of them in 5. So coming 2 down gives me 8, and then 2 down again gives me 6 in half. Two down again gives me 4 in half. Thanks, Ben, for your comment. I hope all of y'all have a great day too. 2 down again for 2 in half. And that will finish out this direction. So, anybody want to put forward a number? There's no wrong number. Could be 3, could be 5, could be 7, could be whatever you want. I'm just going through and reversing each of the new creases. I don't care about reversing the old ones because they were reversed already before. But this will keep my paper in a more neutral orientation, prevent it from trying to curl up as much. Coming into these last 4 before we do another direction. So with this next direction, I'm going to arbitrarily pick this orientation because that's how the paper landed when I flipped it over. And I've got my target intersection. It's near the corner of this grid triangle, this big grid triangle. And I need to figure out how many divisions it is above the bottom here. So looking at it, I can look over to the neighboring grid intersection. So I have an intersection of a new fold and the boundary of the original triangle. And so I can say, okay, how many intersections are there? There's 1, 2, 3, 4, which we would expect because there's 5 spaces, 4 intersections between them. And do these 2 points look like the line between them is parallel to this one? Yes. So we're always going to be able to see that, okay, this one lines up with this, or with this, or with this, or with this. Therefore, it's 1 spacing above this line. So I'm not using math to do this, I'm just visually citing it. I used the math to say, okay, I need my 2 and 3 trapezoid to make sure that this point will be on a grid intersection and will have this property that it will line up with one of these 4 points. But now that it's there, I don't really care which one it is. So let's say in this orientation, I have 5 and 1, so 6 to this bottom line. I can go ahead and bring that up. So I have a choice. Do I treat it as 6 or do I treat it as 4? Either way will work out for me. I have enough references to get things going. And I'm going to choose actually to treat it as 4. So I'll rotate around because 4 is a power of 2 and I can keep dividing it, get more references, more bang for my buck. And so bringing my paper up, I'm going to mark for you real quick the intersections that I'm going to use as references here. And there's more of them that we'll see across the paper. But I can bring these grid intersections to my target intersection and the grid intersection nearby. I'm also going to have these intersections lining up over here and over here. So once those are all lining up, oh, and by the way, there's another one over at the corner, and this line needs to continue through on this line underneath. There's a lot of references once you know how to look for them. I can then open up. I've got my new line. I'd said that this was 4, and so I can divide this in half because it's 2. And now what I need to be able to do my propagating method is all of the divisions in a particular set of 5. So I'm going to then rotate around, bring that next grid line up and I'm going to bring it up to the what is now 4, what we previously folded as 1. Or you could think of it as 1 from the next big grid line. Then opening it up again, I'm going to fold in half, and this line should go straight through my target intersection. And folding all the way through. What do you know? Straight through the target intersection. So it really is a grid intersection of the new grid. So now I get to propagate this grid, and just like I did in the previous direction, where I'm backing off 2 from the one after next big grid intersection, and then I keep backing off 2 each time, and with each odd division you'll get a characteristic set of repetitions that you can use, where it's like, okay, 2 off, 1 above, 1 below, and then splitting 2 in half for the fifths. And then with the thirds, it's like 1 above, 1 below, 1 above, 1 below. And you can just keep going with these new grid lines as much as you like. And for the purposes of speed, well, there is one thing that I will mention first, which is, as usual with a triangle grid on a square, you need to be very careful with how you do your folds in the corners. Oftentimes, the first time that you are doing a direction, a diagonal direction of grid, you will not have great references to fold all the way into the corner. And it's just after you do the second diagonal direction of grid that you'll have better references to fold all the way into the corner. And the same is true when we're working with odd divisions. So bringing this all the way out to the corner is not something that I would want to do with this round of folding. And so I'm going to leave this corner flap unfolded for right now. Like, I know there's going to be 1, 2, 3-ish folds in here, but I don't have great references. I just have lines going this way, not lines coming to the edge with grid intersections. So when I'm doing the other direction, so I've got most of this direction, I can go ahead and show you how I would do the third direction without needing to take all the time that gridding does to get all the way through it. So in this direction, we have many options because once we have 2 directions in the triangle grid, all the grid intersections are defined, and therefore it's like we have lines everywhere. So one option, what I would typically do is finish out a corner, then propagate elsewhere. And so I'll take this section as the first to get the 5 lines. And so I'll bring my edge up, making sure to stop 2 before the next big grid line. And I can tell what's 2 because I'll have these little diamonds in the paper. And I can see where all of my grid intersections are making sure everything is lined up in all the multitude of reference points. And again, this is where reversing your creases helps, because it helps the paper lay flatter instead of doing the scoopy thing that it's doing right now. And then I can come up and do the next one again, 2 spaces below my previous reference line to get my fold 1 spacing below. Excuse me. And from here, we're folding 2 existing lines. So here we not only have the existing lines for references, we also have our grid lines from the first diagonal direction that are coming to grid intersections at the edge of the paper. And it can be a little bit hard to see this without pen, so I'll mark some of those for you. And we do end up having 3 intersections into the corners. So now this corner flap, I can use those existing lines to fold the edge of the paper to match the grid line. Again, keeping in mind this edge of the paper has grid intersections, this edge does not. Excuse me. And so we can keep going in that style all the way to the edge. And then I would propagate out with the next block coming in referenced to this block. So that's everything going for the fifths on a triangle grid on a square. So now we do need a number. What division am I going to fold on this rotated triangle grid? So someone put in a number. I know you're watching. And I'm going to mark my main grid lines. And again, any number, as long as it's not a power of 2. So I don't have a response, which means I get to pick a number. It's going to be 3. And it's going to be 3 partly so I can show you that trick of the thirds where we don't have all of the lines that we need. We have a 7. It's going to be 7. Excellent. So with my rotated grid, notice I have it rotated so that I'm not perpendicular to the edge, I'm not parallel to the edge. And so I'm going to, and so the way that I have this rotated grid set up is that grid intersections are where the center lines meet the edge. So these two are both grid intersections, and I can fold them up to meet my center line, because for 7, I'm going to need some more divisions. And I'm going to do that in all 6 directions. I'm going to do opposite sides at the same time, then reverse my creases. I'm going to make sure to mark everything before I reverse it, so everything is nice and clear. And we will be able to fold 7ths after 1 more division or after this division of 2, once we've done it in all directions. And so bringing my grid lines, or bringing my grid intersections on the edges into the center, I can fold 1, open, fold 2, oh yeah, mark, then reverse. Dun, dun, dun. Dun, dun, dun. And you'll notice that I had said that these two are grid intersections, but I hadn't folded a line between them. And that's because I'm waiting for this third direction to give me enough reference points to fold it precisely. So now that I have those new lines in all 3 directions, you can see I have an intersection here that I can fold so that my upper line and my lower line match in these 2 different directions. And that's going to get me a much better reference for my fold than if I had tried to go from point to point, especially because these angles with the rotated grids get really narrow. And so I'm going to do that on all 6 of my corners of the paper, and then we can start on our 7ths. So what I'm trying to show here is that no matter what paper, what orientation your triangle grid is on, you can still use the same techniques for folding your odd divisions. The division is a property of the grid, not a property of whatever paper you're folding on. And once I have all of these edges, I'm going to go ahead and reverse those folds. But first, make sure to mark them. Another reason to wait for the grid intersection between my 2 centerline points is that I don't want to trust my cutting techniques over my folds. So often my folding is much more precise than my cutting. And so using this intersection to reference the fold is going to be more precise than trusting the edge. So reversing the creases to get the paper nice and flat. I'll return to our gridded side to start folding sevenths. So with our sevenths, we're going to want 4 and 3 in this case because our longest possible edge is 4. And we're going to want the 3 because that's going to allow us to form a trapezoid on grid lines. So I'll mark the corners of my trapezoid. And now we need to find the intersection of diagonals. I can tell right away that it's going to be in this general area because this is the center line of my trapezoid. It needs to lie on that center line because it is a symmetric trapezoid. And it's going to end up being 4 from the tip and 3 from the flat edge of this triangle. So it's going to be here-ish. Using that information, I can keep an eye on where I expect it to be, so I pinch in the correct triangle while I'm setting up my reference diagonal. And since I have so another reference that I have is going to be in the triangle off of the central intersection. So that's what I'm using to keep track of where this needs to be. So I've got mark 1 for one diagonal, and I'll need the second diagonal, again going from corner to corner of our reference trapezoid to get the intersection of diagonals. And there we have it. So we've got 3 on top, 4 on the bottom. 4 is actually a pretty nice number. So I'm going to go ahead and bring this bottom line of the trapezoid up so that that grid intersection meets my reference. And this does not look very stable. Well, it's probably okay. But I think I would rather have more space between my point and my intersection. So I'm going to go on the other side and say, okay, it was 3 on this side plus another 7, which is going to be 10, rotating around so I can fold that point up. Here I'm much more secure about exactly where things need to be. So if that was 10, then the line that I just put in is at 5, which means there's 2 to the next solid grid line. So I'm going to rotate back around and bring that grid line up to meet the line that I just folded. Getting that, depending on how you think about it, the 6 halfway between 5 and 7, because I'm going to rotate back so I can use that for other folds. Rotating back, now I've got the 5 and the 6. I can divide 6 in half to get 3. I'll go ahead and do that. And I'm coming really close to the corner of my hexagon here. And this isn't a reference that I would use. So coming to the corner of the hexagon on a rotated grid, it's like, well, you might hit it, you might not. It's kind of arbitrary. And so we're just trusting our fold lines to get us where we need to go. So we've got a 3, a 5, and a 6. Seems kind of stuck. But what I'm going to do to get us unstuck is reverse the 3 so I can stay in this orientation and fold it up to the 5 to get the 4. So sevenths, you do need to reverse one of your new creases to get all of them. We didn't have to do that with thirds or fifths. Sevenths you do. And there's been some study on like what numbers you don't have to reverse anything to get all of them with. Seven's not one of them. So we've got 3, 4, 5, 6. And so I can bring my bottom edge up to that 4 that we just made. Which makes the 2, and then bring my edge up to the 2 as well to get the 1, and suddenly we have all of the sevenths in this set. So from here we can propagate onwards. I'm going to rotate my paper around, bring my bottom edge up to 2 below the top of that set of sevenths, fold across, and continue the pattern that we established with the fifths of coming 2 down each time. The next one should go straight through our target intersection. Coming 2 down. And the way I'm thinking about this one is 1 above the next line. And through the target intersection. Coming 2 down again, we get our next grid line. And you might have noticed I didn't do this corner, and that was intentional. I'm going to wait until I have all 3 of my divisions to do my corner. And now I'm bringing that original point, the center point of the paper, up to my target intersection again. But now I have a line to fold to instead of just point to point, and it feels much more secure and much more likely to actually be parallel to my target grid lines. Or to just any other grid line. Much less error when you start point to point with greater distance in between the points. And so then I can go again. And if it's getting real curly, I'll leave my bone folder sitting on top. And actually I could leave a pen sitting on top. That I wouldn't have to move. And I'm going to bring my next big grid line 2 spaces below on the latest set of 7, and then come down 2 more for my next line. And who said that gridding can't be interesting? I mean, so many people here watching. It's a wonder that that more people don't fold tessellations. And we get to propagate this all the way down the paper. before doing another direction. And one thing that I'll do if the new divisions that I'm making are fairly small is, instead of doing this division of 2 directly, I'll go ahead and bring up the next big division and then come 2 above the normal sorry, sometimes I can talk and fold, sometimes I can't. So what we did is, instead of making this fold here, I brought this all the way up to above the next big division above. And then when I back it off, instead of going straight to that next big division, because we already have that line, I'm going to come to 2 below. And backing it off 2 at a time, keeping the number of spacings that I'm folding in half even. We end up with our odd divisions all the way across the paper in 2 more folds. So this next one is close enough to the edge of the paper that I don't have a next big division to bring all the way up. So I've got to fold it 2 in half directly, but it's also a narrower part of the paper, so the aspect ratio isn't as bad. So this paper gets very wavy. So it's pretty vital to go ahead and reverse those creases to help the paper lay flat, both so you can see what you're doing and so the paper doesn't move under you while you're folding, to get the next direction of divisions. So that'll take a minute. And it makes nice paper crinkly sounds, so that's fun too. And getting towards the end, there's that one crease that we already reversed, so we don't need to reverse it again. Okay, now we need the other directions. So let's see here. This mark is lining up with 2 above this edge. So we've got our little intersections along this edge of the big grid line. And because we did our trapezoid with 4 and 3 with every edge on a grid line, we know that has to be a grid intersection. And for the math, I've got the blog post on odd grid divisions. And we've got this one lining up with the second mark. So if it's lining up with the second mark, then we have some options. We can bring the central line up and divide it in two, but that's a really skinny division. I don't like doing really skinny divisions, especially not when I'm folding with fewer reference points without a line. But the other direction is 5. And then we start to see, hey, what if we use the division after that? So 5 and 7 is 12. We can bring this line closest to the edge up to our target intersection. And we're going to need to pay attention to how the grid lines cross the paper. And here we're at, well, depending on your lighting, you'll be able to see there are lines going through this top edge. And those are needing to line up with lines from below. And there are also intersections down at the bottom that cause lines in other directions that also need to line up with the existing lines in the paper. Once that's in place, we can go ahead and squash. So that was 12 divided in half. We got 6. And I'm going to fold up to that 6th line to get 3. Again, caring more that my line is going through the grid intersections that are already in place than that the edge of the paper is particularly lining up in some certain way. So if that line is 3, we have 4 spaces between 3 and 7. We can rotate around, bring our 7 up to meet the 3, which will give us 5. And opening up, we can either bring the 3 to the 5 or the 5 to the 3. I'm going to choose to go ahead and rotate around so we're in the reference frame where the numbers make more sense. Reverse the 3 and bring it to the 5 to make 4. So we're setting up our 7ths all over again in this direction. And once we have the 4, we can bring the bottom edge to the 4. And then that makes the 2, bottom edge to the 2, and then we propagate the rest of the lines all the way across the paper. And here we're still holding off on propagating these 7ths all the way out into the corner of the rotated hexagon. We're just getting things going in the other direction, and this is going to make grid intersections in the area where we had our initial grid lines, and those are going to form grid intersections in these 2 corners. And then we'll need the 3rd direction to get the grid intersections in these 2 corners. So that 3rd direction will also give us grid intersections in these corners, and we'll be able to then use those intersections as references to fold the rest of the way. So the process from here is really exactly like I showed you with the 5ths. We're going to rotate our paper around, propagate those 7ths all the way down to here. Then reverse all of those creases, rotate to another direction, and once we have those two grid directions, we will have grid intersections. So say in this whole triangle, we have all of the grid intersections already. So we've got here and 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 here. And we'll be able to use that many points of reference as a line to fold and basically just propagate the third direction all the way across. So that's what I've got for you today for odd divisions on triangle grids. Thank you for Marie for the suggestion of sevenths for the rotated grid. And I hope y'all all have a day full of folding and hope you try some tessellations. All right, happy folding, y'all.